Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ethan Hunt, and I'm an assistant professor here in Health Promotion and Behavioral Sciences at the UT Health School of Public Health in Austin. Today's webinar is hosted by the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living at the UT Health Houston School of Public Health. The center's vision is healthy children in a healthy world, with a mission to advance health and healthy living for children and families through early and impactful interventions. Additionally, information about the center's work and resources can be found online. Please scan the QR code on your screen and access our health resources. The slide and a recording of today's webinar will be archived on our website, msdcenter.org. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter your questions in the Q&A section. With that, I'm excited to introduce our speakers, Dr. Yuzi Zhang and Dr. Christopher Flederer. Yuzi Zhang is a postdoctoral research fellow at the UT Health Houston School of Public Health in Austin and the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living, where she supports several projects on child physical activity, research to policy, and health policy. Her research interests centered on understanding the impact of physical activity on health outcomes and examining how multi-level factors influence physical activity across the lifespan. Chris Flederer's work involves finding ways to optimize scale-up of child obesity-related interventions from both implementation and translational perspectives, with specific expertise in school-based physical activity promotion, serving as both a researcher and former K-12 teacher. He aims to enhance behavioral interventions in rural communities. His current focus has expanded to identify how context influences the 24-hour movement behavior cycle. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Zhang and Flederer with their presentation on active travel, active lives, a public health perspective on school commutes for children.
Thanks, Dr. Hunt, for that great introduction. As Ethan said, I'm Chris Flederer, and I'm going to present first, and then Dr. Zhang will present, and then I'll wrap up the presentation today. We're going to go through four main goals, four main highlights in this presentation. The first thing I'm going to talk about is national and global trends in commute mode to school for kids. I'll then highlight some research on the socio-ecological influences on active commuting, some of the facilitators and barriers of active commuting to school. Dr. Zhang will then talk about evidence from the Texas School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey, the Texas SPAN survey, and also talk about some important public health implications. And then I'll wrap up the presentation by giving you all a review of what is currently working to promote active travel to school in kids. So the data that you're seeing on screen comes from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey. It's a United States-based representative survey of commute mode, and it focuses on children and adults. But this pie chart that you're seeing right now is specifically on means of travel from home to school in the U.S. for children ages 5 to 17. Now, the data are a few years old, but you can see that a little over half are using private vehicles to get to school. A third are using the school bus, and about 10% report that they walk or bike from home to school. We also see the percentage of respondents who are reporting their commute mode, and then this is by distance as well. So one common thing that you'll see in our presentation is that distance is a very large predictor of commute mode to school, and you can see it reflected here in these graphs. So about 80%, if they live less than a quarter mile away from school, report that they're walking and biking. But as distance increases from home to school, that percentage goes down and down and down. And what's typically happening here is it's being replaced by private vehicle transportation. The school bus still takes about 30 to 40%, but a large majority is private vehicles from home to school. We also see the percentage of trips to school on the respective travel day, so not typical routes to school, but what was happening on that day. And those percentages are reflected in this bar graph here. We also see that we're getting data from the 2001 survey, the 2009 survey, and the 2017 survey. Commute mode is relatively stable. We do see a small increase in private vehicle usage across the years from 2001 to 2017. But again, it's very stable. It's sticking around 50 to 55% private vehicle and about 10%. We see a little dip here from 2001 to 2009, but it's still at about 10% walking and biking. If we go back even further, this is a study that was looking at active transportation to school and the trends from the late 60s into 2001. We see some interesting things. First of all, we notice that walking and biking has declined quite a bit. 1970 to 1985, there is a small dip in the early 90s, but then it goes back down across 2001. So walking and biking to school has decreased substantially from about 40% of kids walking and biking to school, again, to about 10 to 15% in 2000. We also see that individual motor vehicle commute mode to school has increased. So again, we're seeing that replacement of walking and biking to school to individual motor vehicles. And just as this has decreased, we can see an increase here from 1970 to 2000. So this is by distance to school. And again, distance is going to be one of our main predictors of walking and biking to school. But we can see that if we look at less than a mile, we can see that the percentage of kids who lived less than a mile from school, about 85% of them were walking and biking to school in 1970. By 2001, those that lived less than 1 mile to school, that percentage has decreased to about half. And we see the same thing with the other distances. So not only is walking and biking to school, the percentage of kids doing it is going down, but also the distance that kids are walking and biking to school or willing to walk and bike to school has decreased from 1970 to 2001. On a global scale, the evidence seems to suggest, for the most part, that walking and biking to school has decreased in a lot of countries. So we see USA is represented here. We have New Zealand, which has a bit of an upswing since 2010. But countries like Australia, the UK, Brazil, China, we see that decrease in walking and biking to school. Some countries are doing a little bit better, like Finland and Ireland. But for the most part, again, on a global scale, we see that decrease in walking and biking to school. Now, why is this important? So why should we be concerned about a decrease of active transportation to and from school? If you do any literature search online, you will find a lot of studies that have looked at the benefits of walking and biking to school with the variety of health outcomes. Largely what we see is that when kids are active traveling to school, it beneficially associates with movement behavior such as physical activity and screen time. It also has physical health outcomes like physical fitness and obesity, and even mental health outcomes. We also see in a lot of research that the act of walking and biking to and from school can track into adulthood. So not only is it good for kids to walk and bike in school, now we also see studies that show walking and biking to and from school is a positive predictor of walking and biking to work. And it may even associate with other health outcomes in adulthood. So there have been studies that have shown that if you're a kid and you walk a bike in school, you're going to be generally physically more active in adulthood as well. The next portion of the webinar is focused more on the predictors of walking and biking to school. So we've shown that active commuting has decreased. Since 1970, there's been a general decline in active commuting. We see that about 10% of kids nationally are walking and biking to school. Most of them are taking private vehicles, and about a third are taking the school bus. We also know, as we've seen from this evidence, that walking and biking to school can beneficially influence outcomes such as obesity and physical activity and screen time and mental health and fitness. And we know that these behaviors can track into adulthood. So what are the predictors of walking and biking to school? And whenever I think about the predictors of a behavior, I always take the socio-ecological approach. So we can think of things from the policy environment, access and characteristics, the built environment, active living domains, perceived environments, and interpersonal factors such as demographics. So we'll go through some of the evidence of what predicts walking and biking to school, all within this socio-ecological model. So this study came out in 2017. There's a lot going on in the graph, but we'll focus on a couple things. We'll focus on distance, which is across, and then we'll focus on the differences in urban and rural. So what the study did is they compared a lot of different characteristics of walking and biking to school. The first one was whether or not kids lived in an urban environment or a rural environment. And then they looked at that across distance. So we see the same thing with distance. The darkest shade here is walking, and then the next darkest shade is biking. So if we focus on those, we see that as distance increases, the percent walking and biking to school decreases, just like all those other studies that I showed you. And we also see some interesting differences in urbanicity as well. So kids who lived in an urban environment, they were a higher percentage of them were walking and biking in 2017 compared to rural. As we get out to the half-mile to 1-mile distance from home to school, we see that that kind of flips. So rural residents, rural kids, there's a high percentage of them walking and biking to school. And then we see the same characteristics as this half-mile distance as we get out 1 to 2 miles away from school. So there's some interesting urban-rural differences happening with walking and biking. We also see a lot of different predictors here of walking and biking to school. So if our little dots and our lines are across this red line, that means it's a significant predictor of walking and biking to school. So distance, of course, is one of them. Gender, sex, as Yuzi will point out, can be a predictor. Typically, males are more likely to walk and bike to school than females. We also see that grade can play an influence. So if we think about age, a lot of the times middle schoolers will have more independent mobility. High schoolers will even have more independent mobility, but at a certain point they get their driver's license. And if you've got your driver's license in a car for a high school kid, you're probably not going to want to walk and bike to school. So age can influence walking and biking in a variety of ways. Obviously, families who don't own vehicles, they're going to be much more dependent on either the school bus or walking and biking. But as the number of vehicles per driver increases, the more likely you're going to take a vehicle to school than walk and bike. Household income can influence walking and biking significantly, and population density as well. This next study is a systematic review of factors related to active school travel. And this was in North America, so US, Canada, and Mexico. So they looked at individual characteristics, they looked at parent characteristics, and they looked at environmental characteristics. And this really gets at that socio-ecological model of active living that I was talking about before. And what they did is they reviewed a bunch of different articles that looked at associations between all of these characteristics. And they counted up the number of articles that reported either a not significant influence on walking and biking, a negative influence on walking and biking, or a positive influence on walking and biking. And regardless of the negative or positive, I really just want to focus on the darker, the black shade here and the gray shade here. So of the 33 studies that they reviewed, 12 showed that sex had some sort of a relationship with walking and biking. The majority of of studies showed that age and grade had a significant relationship with walking and biking. And in terms of race ethnicity, I think the evidence is a bit mixed. 15 showed there's no significant relationships with walking and biking, but 14 either showed a positive or a negative. So that could go either way. These are the individual parent characteristics in relation to active travel to school. We see that parent education can play a role or can be a significant predictor of walking and biking, although employment and parent gender, this review anyway showed that none of the studies showed a significant relationship with walking and biking. Income, the evidence is mixed here. About half showed a relationship to walking and biking. And then school bus access was the other big one. So there were 5 studies that showed some sort of relationship with walking and biking. 4 of them showed a negative relationship, and 1 of them showed a positive relationship, which makes sense. If you don't have good school bus access, you're more likely to either walk and bike or take an individual car. And then finally, and distance, our favorite one here, 15 out of the 15 studies indicated there was a negative relationship, a significant negative relationship between distance to school and walking and biking. Of course, we've seen that time and time again. We have some mixed evidence for things like land use mix and intersectional density, but we do see some significant influences on things like the presence of sidewalks, traffic volume and density, the walkability, and residential housing density as well. So there's all sorts of things that can influence walking and biking to school. Not only is it personal child characteristics, it can be parent characteristics, it can be built environment characteristics too. There's all sorts of study, as this review shows, of the amount of individual studies on built environment and active travel to school, which, as we'll talk about later, is very hard to change. So many times interventions will target things that are a little bit easier to change. The last study I'll highlight is one that I did a few years ago. And our study team was interested in not only looking at the influence of parent and child perceptions of barriers to active school commuting separately, but we also wanted to know how parents and children perceive those barriers differently, and then what influences active commuting to school. So we were getting at this question of who's driving the decision to actively commute to school. Is it more so on the parents? Is it more so on the kids? Is it a mixture of both? And how do their perceptions differ? So what we did is we gave parent-child dyads a survey. So we had parents take a survey and we had kids take a survey. And the survey was on barriers to active commuting. And I'll show you a list of the barriers we measured here in a minute. They were the same questions. We worded them slightly different for the kids just so they could understand them a bit better, but they were getting at the same constructs. And then we compared their responses. So they were all on a Likert scale. 1, you don't agree at all, to 5, you do agree. So the distance, do you agree that, it's a barrier to walking and biking to school? 1, I don't agree. 5, I really agree. So we gave them the same survey, and then we statistically compared their responses to see if there were differences in their response. And then at the school level, teachers asked kids each day, how did you get to school? So this is a very common way to track active commuting behavior. And we did that across 5 days. And we asked, how did you get to school? And then from the previous day, how did you get home from school? So we had all this data. So in terms of parent-reported children's commute mode and frequency of commute mode to and from school during an average school week across 5 days, Frequency to school, it was about 1.5 days that kids walked, and the rest they took a car or a bus. The frequency to home, that increased a little bit, so about 2.25 days out of the week they walked home from school. And so for a total average, and again, this would be out of 10 because you've got 5 days of going to school, 5 days of coming back from school. About 4 of those trips were walking, and about 6 were taking the car or the bus. Biking did constitute a little bit of that, but not a lot. Now this table is really big, but I just want to focus on these first 2 columns here, and then this T statistic here. So this is where we were comparing perceptions, parent and child perceptions. And if this number is bolded, that means there's a significant difference between the parent response and the child response. And if this number is negative, that means that the parent response was higher. They were more likely to agree. If the response is positive, the child was more likely to agree. So we see a few things going on here. We see some disagreement between several of the questions between parent and kids. The questions included too many hills, no sidewalks, the route is boring, perceptions of traffic, dangerous crossings, the presence of no other children walking and biking, and then the planning that it takes to walk and bike, and the presence of crime as well. So those were our differences here. For the first 2, too many hills, no sidewalks, the parents were more apt to strongly agree. There's too many hills, there's no sidewalks, my kid can't walk or bike. The child was less likely to agree. There's not too many hills, sidewalks are fine. In terms of the route is boring, most the kids were more likely to agree or have higher agreement. Yes, this route is boring. I don't want to walk and bike it every day. And the parents seemed to think the route was fine. This one really stuck out to us: traffic and dangerous crossings. So the parents were much more likely to respond. I highly agree with this statement. There's a lot of traffic. There's dangerous crossings, and from a child perspective, their perceptions were, oh, it's not dangerous. There's not traffic. So there were some disagreements there. And then the same thing with crime as well. Kids didn't perceive a high level of crime, and parents did. So we see some interesting differences in how they respond to the survey. And then in terms of that final question, who really controls the decision to walk or bike to school? Is it parents or is it kids? And mind you, these are all elementary age kids. These are 3rd through 5th graders. So if it's bold, that means that there was some sort of a significant relationship between active school commuting and the perception. So a couple things. These 2 questions here, it's easier to drive and it takes a lot of planning. These were both negatively correlated, both from the parent and the children, with active commute mode to school. So even though there was some disagreement with the question, both parents and kids' perception of it's easier to drive and it takes too much planning influence active school commuting. Another one with both parents and children, even though they slightly disagreed on the question, both of their perceptions influenced active commuting. And then finally, with the parents, there were quite a few other things that influence active school commuting where the children perceptions didn't. So things like too many hills, and dangerous crossings. So the conclusion of this study was parents and children may disagree a little bit on their perceptions of the barriers to active school commuting, but based on these these partial correlations, parents and children do seem to take somewhat of an active role in the decision to actively commute to school. So it's not all on the parent to decide, hey, you're going to walk and bike today, or you're not going to walk and bike today. Children's perceptions do seem to influence that as well. So when we think about interventions that maybe provide education of walking and biking to school, This study seems to suggest that we shouldn't just be focusing on the parents, even though they are an important, rule maker and decision maker in the family. We should also be focusing on the kids as well. How can we change their perceptions? How can we educate them on walking and biking to school? I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zhang now for her part of the presentation, and then we'll come back around to me for the end.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Flatterer, for setting up the stage for talking about the predictors for active transportation to school and very interesting results for the parent-kids perceived barriers of active commuting to school. Now, I would like to shifting our attention to a more localized context. My presentation will focus on finding from a recent study we conducted among the Texas children. So I will walk you through the two questions we have for the studies. As we know, the active commuting to school can contribute to the overall physical activity for children, and there's a decreasing trend in active transportation nationally and in most countries worldwide. So we are wondering what's the current status of active commuting to school among Texas children? And further, for Texas children, what are some potential social demographic factors and physical environmental factors that could influence their school travel mode? So first of all, I would like to introduce you the data source we use for the current study. It's the Texas School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey, the Texas SPAN. So Texas SPAN is a statewide surveillance system and is cross-sectionally collecting data using questionnaire at 6 time points. It's starting the first year during the 2000 and 2002. And Texas SPAN are state representative data at the state level, public health region level, and at the Texas-Mexico border and non-border areas. So this survey measure child health and related health behavior of school-age children in second, fourth, eighth, and 11th grades. The purpose of this project is to monitor the prevalence of overweight and obesity among the children and identify some factors related to obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes, such as dietary behaviors and physical activities. While lastly, the information for the Texas SPAN project are used to assist the program development and policy to promote healthy weight and prevent the chronic disease among the Texas youth. So the current study, we use the Texas SPAN data from 2019 to 2020, and this was the 5th time that the statewide project was conducted. And one thing special about this data collection period is because it was interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and therefore we have a smaller sample size compared to the previous year. However, the statewide and Texas Mexico border non-border sampling rate were still able to calculate it. So therefore, we still have a really good representative data for the Texas statewide and for the border non-border area. Some of the variables of interest for the current studies. First is the demographic characteristics of the children, the sex, race, and ethnicity. And we were also interested in the socioeconomic status, including the percentage of economically disadvantaged students in the school and the percentage of limited English proficiency students in the school. About the environmental factor, we are looking at the community type, which means are you living in the major urban communities, or rural communities? And we are also interested in the kids living in the Texas-Mexico border regions versus non-border regions. The outcome for this study was the school travel modes. So the students were asked in the survey to report their school travel mode by answering the question on most days during the week, how do you arrive at school? So the original question have 5 options, including walking, biking, taking school bus, taking city bus, and by car. The walking and biking are active commuting mode, and they were combined as one category in the study. And we also combined the school bus and city bus due to their low reported frequency, and they are pretty similar passive travel mode. Well, the following 2 slides will show you some of the numbers of the characteristics of the study participants. So the current study, we use data from 65 school districts and 177 schools across Texas, which including 7,371 students from 4th, 8th, and 11th grade. This representing 1,029,983 students. The majority of the students were living in urban communities, and 9% of them were living in the rural community, and 22% of them were living in the major urban communities. So the community type here was determined using the Texas Education Agency criteria and applied to the school districts located within each of the Texas A public health regions. So the 2 largest school districts in each public health region were defined as the major urban communities, and the school district from counties with population above 50,000 were designated as urban communities, and the rest of school were designated as rural. So in this studies, we have more than 1/5 of the students were living in Texas Mexico counties. Okay, more about the participants. So we have about half of the girls and half of the boys. In terms of the age for each grade, the 4th graders are about 9 years old, and 8th graders are about 13 years old, and 11th graders are 16 years old. Breaking down by the race and ethnicity distributions, so over half of the participants in the studies are Hispanics, and 36% are white and other, 12% are African Americans. In terms of the school travel mode, not surprisingly, travel to school by car was the most common travel mode, with over 70% of the students from all 3 grades are travel to school by car. And the next most common travel mode was taking bus, with about a quarter of students taking school bus or city bus most day to the school. And lastly, less than 5% of the students walking or biking to school. So from the last slides, I show you that less than 5% of the school-age students in Texas regularly walking and biking to school. This horizontal bar graph shows the school travel mode by each grade level. So consistent with the overall distribution, walking and biking was the least common travel mode in 4th, 8th, and 11th grade students. Well, however, interestingly, the 4th graders had the highest percentage of walking and biking to school, for about 6.4% of them working and biking regularly. And this prevalence decreased to 4.8% in 8th graders. And the prevalence kept further decreased to 3.2% in 11th grade students. Travel to school by car was always the most prevalent mode for 4th, 8th, and 11th grades. Well, the first part of the study, we described the current prevalence of active commuting to schools, and we're moving to the second part of study, for which we aim to explore some potential factors that are associated with walk and bike to school. And we are exploring these factors by students' grade level. So first of all, compared to travel to school by car, we found that boys are more likely to walk and bike to school than girls. And this finding was consistent among 4th, 8th, and 11th grade students. Regarding the race and ethnicity, African American students in 4th and 11th grades were more likely to commute by bus rather than car compared to white and other students. Other than socioeconomic, social demographic factors, we found that physical environment also affect the school travel mode. Well, for example, among the 4th graders, those who living in urban community were more likely to take bus rather than by car to school compared to those who living in the major urban communities. However, among the 8th graders, those who living in urban community were less likely to walk and bike than those living in major communities. And living in the border region also influenced students' school travel modes. For 11th graders living in the Texas-Mexico border county, they were more likely to walk and bike to school than those in the non-border counties. So taking together some summary and implication from the studies, we found that the majority of the 4th, 8th, and 11th grade students use an active mode of travel to get to the school, and primarily by car. The rate of active commuting to school, or ACS, was less than half of the latest national average of about 10%. And ACS was highest among the younger kids, among the 4th graders, and steadily declined in 8th and 11th grades. So this trend is consistent with earlier studies and likely reflected how the school system are structured. So many school districts follow a feeder pattern in which several elementary school fits into a single middle school and several middle school fits into a single high school. Therefore, this school system including a greater number of elementary school, fewer middle school, and even fewer high school. And most of the time, the elementary school are smaller and cover a smaller catchment area in the community, and therefore students living in the community have a shorter travel distance to school, which makes the active commuting to school more practical and feasible. However, on the other hand, the middle school and high school campuses are typically larger and encompass larger attendance catchment areas. Therefore, students enrolled at a higher grade level will need to travel further distance, and they are less likely to walk or bike. Unlike other predictors that have like different association with the grades, boys are consistently more likely to active commute to school than girls across all the grade levels. And there's some explanation for these findings. First, some previous studies show that boys often have greater physical fitness and higher self-efficacy in overcoming barriers to engage in physical activity. So for example, if there's a longer commuting distance and there might be some challenges of the route terrain, such as changes in the elevations, or the kids have to carrying school materials like backpack or band instruments, it is possible that boys themselves and their caregivers are more confident and capable to think they can still engage in ACS in these scenarios. And furthermore, other reasons for boys engaging in active commuting to school more frequently than girls is because boys are more likely to consider their built environment safer than girls in the same areas. And then the last point I want to mention is that we not only observe the sex-based differences in engaging in active commuting to school, we also see that in the overall physical activity levels, it's always that the girls are always lower than boys. So therefore, some future studies and interventions are needed to close this sex-based gap and help the girls to engage in more physical activity and active commuting schools. So moving on, in these studies, we also observe prominent factors related to physical environment. So for example, 8th graders living in urban community were less likely to engage in active commuting to school than those living in larger major urban communities. So this association can be part due to the urbanization that has happened over the recent decades in Texas cities and towns. So this transformation of the cities are often categorized by population growth and reduce the housing density in the areas surrounding major cities. However, some of the consequences of urbanizations including increases in the roadway construction, traffic congestion, and also can reduce the neighborhood connectivity and walkability. And therefore, people have a greater reliance on the personal automobiles for transportation rather than walking or biking from one place to another. Well, of course, in some communities, built environment change by the urbanization could potentially have positive effects on the physical activity and active transportation. So, for example, some of the environmental change provide more sidewalk and bike lanes to increase walkability in the community, or there could be more parks that place in the community and improve the facility to allow the people in the community to have more place for leisure time physical activity and sports and active transportations. But we also have evidence showing that in addition to this physical infrastructure improvement to facilitate the active transportations, programs and policy are still needed to promote the ACS in children. Interestingly, we found that on the 11th grade students who live in the border regions were more likely to engage in active commuting to school, but such association was not found in the younger kids for 4th and 8th graders. So children's independent mobility can affect their engagement in active transportation, and there are multiple factors that could influence children's independent mobilities, which include the age and parental perceptions of the children's independent mobility and the parental perception of the social and physical environment. So parents may be more comfortable allowing their kids to walk or bike to school when they're older. So even though these kids are residing in the border regions where they're more likely to face like high injury-related mortality or live in a poverty settings. Um, Therefore, it's possible that for this like 11th grade children who live in the border regions, who are disproportionately affected by the poverty and insufficient resources, engage in more active commuting purely due to a lack of alternative transportation such as school and city bus, or they have a limited number of available household vehicles compared to their non-border counterparts. So for these children, walking and biking to school were out of necessity rather than they choosing a passive form of transportations. So therefore, our finding raised a huge health concern for these children, such as the traffic safety and injury, and suggest like a health disparity by geographic locations remain significant. So some implication from these studies, health behavior are easier to form in younger children and can benefit later lives. Therefore, we should encourage younger children to engage in active commuting to school and promote these positive behaviors throughout life. While second, programs and supports are needed to close the gap between female and male students in overall physical activity and active commuting to schools. Also, given the current school system structure, the negative effect of the increased commuting distance need to be accounted for as children transition into intermediate schools to facilitate them sustaining the physical activity and active commuting to school. And lastly, the positive physical infrastructure improvement are really critical to support children's active commuting to school. But school-based programs like education and local policy are still needed to be in place to promote the active community schools in addition to the built environment changes. Oops, my bad. And then this slide shows you some resources based on the Texas SPAN data. As I mentioned, the Texas SPAN study has been monitoring children's health behaviors and outcomes since 2000. And the research team has created infographics and toolkits to help you learn more about and advocate for Texas child health. We also have an interactive website to show data by different variables to help you learn more about the prevalence across different years. Now I will hand it back to Dr. Flederer to talk about some evidence-based intervention and strategies for ACS promotion.
Thanks, Dr. Zhang. Yeah, so for the last few minutes, we've been talking about this global decline in active commuting, some of the factors that relate to this decline, what predicts active commuting to school, and so on and so forth. But one thing that we haven't discussed yet is, what's currently working right now to effectively promote walking and biking to school. So there's been several reviews on this. Some of the strategies and effects of these school-based interventions to promote active travel to school. And instead of getting into the numbers, I thought I'd just summarize what some of these reviews are saying, and then also highlight some other strategies that are currently being used to promote active travel to school. So based on the academic reviews that have been done, there's two really effective strategies that seem to work. The first one is the walking school bus. So for those of you on this call, many of you might have an interest in active travel to school. So many of you probably know what the walking school bus is. But it's this really neat program where an adult takes the lead. They're in charge of a group of kids, usually walking 2 by 2, at various stops along the route. So it's mimicking a school bus, but they're walking along the route. One thing about the walking school bus, it does need volunteers, right? Either parent volunteers or school volunteers. So you really need a champion at your school if you're gonna include a walking school bus program. But that seems to be one thing that is quite effective at promoting active travel to school at least among elementary age kids. The other thing that the reviews have shown that's been effective is providing educational support for children and their families and schools on safety, routes to school. Providing them with maps with safe routes to school is always a good thing to do, and other educational activities that help parents and kids navigate walking and biking to school. Partnering with programs such as Safe Routes to School, that's the big one in most states in the United States. But partnering with those types of programs can also be very effective. They can go in and do a lot of the work in terms of providing educational resources for children and families. They can help schools implement programs such as the walking school bus. There's Golden Sneakers as well, which is kind of like a competition thing. Other programs like that. They can also help partner with local law enforcement to promote traffic safety. So things like crossing guards and just adult presence out in the street on the route to and from school. I'll also highlight Safe Routes to School operates on this, this 6E principle. So things from education to engineering to engagement and encouragement and equity, they work in that framework to really promote walking and biking to school when possible. And then finally, improving infrastructure. And an improvement of infrastructure can do wonders for the number of students walking and biking to school. However, and you can see this in small parentheses underneath, this takes a lot of time, a lot of money. Usually there's policy involved. It's a much larger thing than providing educational resources or a walking school bus, which is why we see those things happen in interventions usually a lot more than an intervention where the infrastructure is improved. So things like improving land use mix and local accessibility, traffic calming devices, connectivity, aesthetics, all of those things could be improved to influence active commuting to school. But again, takes a lot more time and a lot more money to do. All right, with 10 minutes left, I'm going to pass it back over to Dr. Hunt for our Q&A session, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang and Flederer. We'll now move to our questions from the audience. We have a bunch coming in, and if you see the top right of your screen on the Q&A button, you can add more questions as we go through. So our first question was asked early on, but I think it may be most appropriate for Yuzi. It was just talking about maybe we see these dips in historical trends, whether that be because of factors related to policy, whether that be less neighborhood schools, a rise in charter and private schools. And just for context, here in Texas, Senate Bill 2, I believe it was just passed, where essentially we now have a law in place with school choice. And essentially that just means your child does not have to go to the school of which you're zoned for. So we may see more traveling by vehicle to get to the school of which the parent and families have chosen. Well, again, which may not be in your neighborhood. So Yuzi, I know that with SPAN, we ask these questions yearly. Is there any plan to, you could essentially, we'll be able to track exactly when that law was put into place and see if we have differences in those trends of active commuting to school. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a really good questions. Yeah, I do things like there's definitely less neighborhood schools and not even going back to that farther away from 1960s and even in my experience, like even after COVID. So one of the project I work in, we work with like a lot of elementary school in Austin, and we saw a couple elementary school closure because people are moving out of the Austin and go to those suburb cities for like a better living conditions, bigger house, and so their kids are moving out. Therefore, some school closure due to that. Yeah.
I'll jump in too
Yeah.
real quick. So a lot of my research is looking at urban-rural differences in these types of behaviors, whether it be physical activity or active commuting. And one thing we see when we look at urban-rural differences is the catchment areas for, I know using areas a little while ago, and it's a really good point. But the catchment areas for rural elementary schools tends to be much larger than urban elementary schools. We still see rural kids walking and biking to school, even at longer distances. But on the whole, what we see is typically urban schools are a lot closer comparatively. So I lived out in Utah, and there was a rural county that only had, I think, one elementary school in the entire county. And so buses would run. I mean, kids would sit on a bus for 2 hours to get to school, right? So there was no way that they were going to walk and bike to school. But I think that catchment area is a key piece to think about because it increases the distance. And we know distance is the biggest predictor of walking and biking to school. So it's a good point.
Yeah, and again, with our most recent bills being passed for school choice, we'll be able to track some of that with upcoming SPAN surveys as we collect that yearly to see if we do have dips in prevalence rates of active commuting. This person said, additional barriers to non-active commuting. They have an example here. They said, my kids were at a school where the drop off by car took what felt like 10 minutes. I noticed families driving to a quarter-mile distance to the school and dropping their kids off there. It seems like it's almost an opportunity for a project. Chris, I know you've done some implementation and intervention work. I have this idea of drop-off zones. Have you seen any of this in the literature where, I've seen these really long lines at school drop-offs, and that could be interrupting parents' commute time and ability to get to work. Are there ideas of essentially, a drop-off zone where you can get active commuting as well, but it also helps the parents on one side on their commute too?
Yeah, it wasn't here in Texas. It was in a different state that I worked on a project like this where the schools had a drop-off zone. And the reason why it prompted us to do a project was because we would do these in-school surveys, and we would say, how did you get to school today? And a lot of the kids would say, well, we drove a part of the way and then we walked another part of the way. And we thought, what's going on? And so we asked the school about it, and they had developed these drop-off zones. They had a relatively large catchment area as well. And uh, it was a smaller school, so they didn't have the infrastructure for parent drop off. And there was only one school bus that was going to the school. So everyone was driving to school, even though it was a smaller school. And so they built them really just to relieve congestion in the school drop off area. But what it did was increase the rates of walking and biking to school. Now, it wasn't as far as the home to school, but if you're living 5 miles away and you drop your kid off a half mile away, they're still getting in a half mile of walking or biking. And so I think that that's a very good strategy. The key is just, does the school have the infrastructure to support that? And then also, does the neighborhood have the infrastructure to support that? Because when you're talking about developing drop-off zones a half mile away, you need to have a safe space to do that. That's kind of outside of the school. So all those things need to be considered when you're doing something like that.
Yeah, it seems like it could be a really low-hanging fruit for schools too to implement some of this from a resource perspective. We had a couple questions about barriers. One was related to weather as a predictor. I know we probably can't capture that within the SPAN study, but if either of you know about, especially in the South, predictors with regarding weather to impeding active commuting, a comment on that would be great. But also, this person had mentioned a shift, or another person had mentioned an earlier shift in start times could potentially impact travel as well. So additional barriers. It seems like this person said it seems like school days start even earlier now. There's been pushes across the country to go for later start times, impacting sleep of children and adolescents. But yeah, have we seen any data on those two barriers? Either one of you could probably jump in on this one.
Yeah, I can start with the weather. I think the weather one's definitely people would think it's like a big factors, but it's actually really hard to um I guess obtain the data for. So it's like we might have like a bad weather day, but our people perceive that as a bad weather, or it's just like heavy rain to stop you from walking or biking to school. So we did a study like comparing how people perceive the weather and how actually measured by the weather station, and just don't have agreement with that. And also the weather is also depends on where you are. I mean, in Texas, maybe below 70, you feel it's really cold out there. But that's another story in Minnesota. Maybe people feel so comfortable working outdoors at that degrees. Um, also I will also want to mention that for the weather is more for Texas, more like heat in the summer might prevent people from walking and biking to school, but I don't think we have really good evidence out there to conclude that, so it's pretty inconclusive. But I would say it's definitely impact something, but not contribute to affecting the whole behaviors.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here. This person asked, is school transportation available to all students? In this particular case, this person is saying in our community, it's not provided for those who live within a 2-mile radius of the school. I believe, Chris, you could probably answer this, that this is probably specific to districts and state policies, but do you know if that's across the board? If you go to a public school, there is transportation available to you?
Yeah, it's variable depending on the state, depending on the district. But I would say that I don't know if it's a 2-mile rule, but most of the elementary schools that I've worked with have some sort of a distance rule, whether it be 1 mile or 2 miles. Sometimes it's even a half mile. Um, but that is a policy that can actually shift students from walking and biking and using transportation like a school bus, which environmentally is a little bit better than taking an individual car. It can shift that from taking the school bus to individual cars. So, it's not really influencing personal health, but environmentally speaking, that shift can have implications for the number of cars, in a drop-off area. And if you're right on that 2-mile zone, if you know you're a mile and 3/4 away from school, you're probably not going to walk or bike. You're just going to end up taking a car anyway. So yeah, those policies do exist.
Excellent. Okay, I think we are at time, so I just want to let everyone know the recording, slides, and resources mentioned will be posted at msdcenter.org, along with information about upcoming webinars. And you will also receive a follow-up email with links to all of these. Again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar, and we will see you next time.